Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Coming up today on The Story.
God had given us a little girl earlier. She was lovely, but now he's taken from us this lovely little boy, beautiful child. That was the biggest challenge. I can tell you it was so difficult. I went outside and I sat on the side of a well. When I sat on the side of the well, I shook my fist in the face of God and said, why? Why? What have we done? Why have you taken this child from us?
The Story.
G'day, I'm Jimmy Colefax. Welcome to The Story. Well, today we have part 2 of our conversation with Bill Forward, who's sharing his and his wife Glad's story. Glad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2004, and they were both featured on the 60 Minutes TV program in a segment called For Better or Worse. Last time we heard how they grew up together and eventually became a couple. Today we'll hear how they eventually married and were led by the Lord to be missionaries in India. We'll also hear about some of the challenges they faced as a young married couple in a foreign land. All that and more is coming up as Bill Forward continues his chat with Eric Scatterbo.
We've been going to those evening Bible studies together, but I just knew that I needed more. I was going to be a missionary. That was what God wanted me to do. I was absolutely convinced. So I then enrolled in a Bible college in Sydney, and of course that meant 2 years away from her. And one of the rules of the Bible college was that we were not to have establish any relationship between ourselves and the opposite sex while we were there, unless we were engaged to be married or already married. So I thought, well, I'm going to fix this up because I'm going to be away for Glad for 2 years. I wanted her to be absolutely assured that I would keep my promises to her, and I loved her. And I said to her, even though we were very young, will you marry me? I went around to see her mum. I asked her mum for permission to ask her, and then we were engaged before I went to Bible college. And I was away for 2 years. I did come back for a little bit in the middle of it, like at the end of semesters and things like that. But basically, she knew that I loved her, that we were promised to each other. And even though I was away for 2 years doing that, I would come back and we would together do things for God. Now, that, of course, is really an interesting part because that brings us to the time when I had to make a decision about what the Lord wanted me to do. I studied really hard. I excelled in the studies. I did Greek, I did a bit of Hebrew, and I studied the scriptures. I devoted myself to do it because I knew I had a purpose. I needed to prepare to be what God wanted me to be. And in my second year, I was studying and passed exams in John's Gospel. I got good marks in most of those subjects. But this Sunday, I was going back through John's Gospel to more or less see it from a devotional point of view rather than from the academic point of view. And as I read chapter 20 of John's Gospel, it was an amazing experience to me. Suddenly, verse 21 of John's Gospel stood out of that chapter 20. And verse 21 said, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. And it was as if that came out of the page. And this was my calling. This is what God wants me to do. This is who I must now be, because as the Father sent Jesus, he was now sending me to be a messenger of the gospel, a teacher of God's word. I just absolutely surrendered right there. Yes, Lord, I'll go. But naturally, the question was where?
Yeah.
So I went, this was Sunday morning, and so I went along to my church, and it was in Sydney, of course. And as I was there, I noticed some families from Queensland families that I knew. Now, I didn't intend to stay for the sermon because we had an afternoon program with young people. And I thought I'll just wait until they have a communion service. And then after that, they'll have the sermon. So I'll leave. But once I saw that family, I couldn't leave. I had to stay to see them. So I did. And I still remember the secretary of the church. He got up to give whatever announcements there were right at the very end. As he gave the announcements, he said, oh, yes, so there you go. But then he went to sit down. Oh, excuse me. I got a letter this week. It came by sea. I need to read it to you. And in that letter was a letter from an elderly couple in India who said, we're reaching the stage where we need to consider retiring from the work here. Is there a student in the Bible college? Is there someone called by the Lord who would be willing to come to India? This person needs to be someone who's good at languages, who is good as this and good at that and good at something else. And this person ideally will be married or engaged to be. Look, it was me.
Yeah.
The description, it was so I went to the secretary. I said, please, can I have that letter? That letter is for me, not for you. It's for me.
Yeah.
And I took that letter and I wrote immediately to India and said to them, God has called me. I'm the man. What do you want me to do? How do I go about coming to it? Now, in the meantime, poor Glad, she didn't know anything about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, did she know anything about her future?
She did not. And we were just at the end of the semester. I got in a train, came back to Brisbane. I went straight round to her house and I said, my sweet, God has called me to go to India. And she looked at me. I thought she'd be delighted, but she wasn't. She was afraid. No. She said, well, what about me? What about me? Well, you'll be my wife. No, I won't be a missionary's wife. I have also to be called by God to go. And I thought to myself, well, God will definitely call you because we know it's God's will for us to be together. He's called me, he'll call you. Eric, the amazing thing is that our church has had a series of what we call missionary conferences once every 3 months in different areas. And in Ashgrove in Brisbane, that weekend, when I had just come back from Bible college, just told Glad that I was called to India, there was a missionary conference at Ashgrove. So I went with her to that conference, and there was a gentleman there who was a visiting missionary. He came from Angola in Africa, of all places. And as he stood to speak, he looked out at the congregation and he pointed out with his finger. I can still see it today. He said, if you are 21 and God has called you to the mission field, go. And I thought, how does he know? How does he know? I'm thinking I'm only 21. I'm really too young for this. But he said, no, 21 is the exact time you should go because you're bold, you're courageous, you can learn the language, you have no children, you have no difficulty. So for me, I just felt that God has sent this man as a incredible confirmation, if you like, to what he had said to me down in Sydney.
Yeah, but what about Glad?
Well, his next sentence was this: if you're the fiance or the wife of such a person, you go.
Oh,
and
wow.
I could feel her hands in mine. We were sitting there, and suddenly she heard it, and she said, yes, yes.
Wow.
And so God confirmed it to us on that day. Look, I tell you, I have never forgotten it. It is there in my heart. It is that calling that is the will of God. And both Glad and I then went with God's hand upon us to go to India. It was amazing.
And this was about 1960?
It was 1962.
Okay.
When that happened. And so I had been in correspondence with India. In those days, everything was slow. Airmail was not very good. In fact, there was no airmail. Everything was going by ship. And so it was really difficult to get things. The Indian missionary folks sent a message saying, that's wonderful. We want to welcome you. We're very glad. Now we suggest you come as single people. You come individually and you'll go to Bible college singly or to a language college singly. And then after you've been here for a period, then you can get married and all that sort of thing.
Why did they not want you to be married?
I don't know. I don't know.
That was just the policy.
Yeah, it was their policy. But my church leaders said, no way, no way. We want you to be married before you go. And so they said, we will do everything to help you. And so they corresponded with the people in India and said, we know what you've said, but we know that it's not God's will for them to go singly. We want them to be married. We want to send them to you as a young married couple. And then after that, they can learn the language and they can support one another in the midst of whatever it is they're doing. So we were very grateful. And yes, in May 1963, we were married on the 18th of May, and we're just so grateful to God that we've had all these wonderful years together serving Him.
You're listening to The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is once again chatting with Bill Forward, who's sharing his and his wife Glad's story. We've just heard how the Lord led them to be missionaries in India. Next, we'll hear about their experiences there, including how the Lord used a tragedy to help their ministry in an unexpected way. All that and more when we return.
The Story. If this program has highlighted something you'd like prayer for, we'd love to pray for you. Call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. It's a free call. Or text 0401 132 888.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax, and this is The Story. We're back with more of Eric Scatterbo chatting with Bill Forward, who's sharing his and his wife Glad's story. Before the break, we heard how the Lord led Bill and Glad to be missionaries in India when they were a young couple in their early 20s. Next, we'll hear that it wasn't all smooth sailing in India and that they faced some major disappointments.
The biggest challenge, I guess, came to us when our second child was born. Mm-hmm. This child was a beautiful boy. Now, Glad is quite a petite person, but this lovely little baby was 10 pounds 10 in the old scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
quite big.
A big baby for a small lady or a petite lady. Mm-hmm. Beautiful child, but he just faded. And 28 hours later, he died. That was such a shock to us. Mm-hmm. God had given us a little girl earlier. She was lovely, but now He's taken from us this lovely little boy, beautiful child. That was the biggest challenge. I can tell you it was so difficult. So much so that they sedated Glad, which is good for her, but for me, no. The child had just faded away and had passed away. I went outside and I sat on the on a side of a well. When I sat on the side of the well, I shook my fist. I confess it. Mm-hmm. I shook my fist in the face of God and said, "Why? Why? What have we done? Why have you taken this child from us?" And I was so upset, so angry. I mean, now I feel ashamed. And then while I was sitting there, a Marathi man, an Indian man, came and sat beside me. Now, he was a friend of mine, and we'd worked together, but he was an ex-leprosy patient, but he was a very clever guy in all sorts of practical ways. And he and I did a lot of the maintenance, and we did some different things, programs and projects together. And he sat beside me, and he put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, "So you're one of us, are you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" I was angry. "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, our babies die. We think we're very bad people, and so our babies die, but you're a good person. You're a missionary." And I said, "But because your baby has died, we realize that you're one with us." And the interesting thing was that he then said, "We can listen to you now." And I suddenly realized that between the so-called missionaries and the congregation, if you like, there was this barrier that we were seen as being superior beings, whereas they saw themselves as lower beings. And yet that was not the case. This brought me back to them, and that made all the difference in my ministry there. It was an amazing thing. There was a big turnaround. So India in those days was not well provided for. There was no ice, there was no storeroom, there was no cold room, there was no nothing. The child died in the evening, and next morning by 8 o'clock, we had to take the child and bury the child. Not allowed to bury at nighttime. It was against the law. So this child we had to go 70, 80 Ks to bury the child in a Christian cemetery. You know that Hindus burn their dead and the Muslims bury, but Christians have to have a cemetery all of their own. So we had one about 70 Ks away. So we put the little baby, well, strangely enough, I was almost out of action. Glad was completely out of action. And one of our lovely missionary friends, she got an apple box. She put a little sheet around the apple box and placed the body of our beautiful child in that apple box. And there it was on the table. And in the morning, we put it in the back of the car and drove the 70, 80 Ks to the place where he'd be buried. Some kind friends had dug a grave for us. And when we got down there, I got into the grave itself, and they handed me the apple box, and I put it at the bottom of the grave. And we sang in their language, "Safe in the Arms of Jesus." It's a lovely lovely song that still brings tears to my eyes whenever I hear it. But that was what happened when our baby died. And of course, we were traumatized by all of this. Glad was still recovering from a difficult birth, and I was heartbroken completely. And we got a phone. I'd sent a telegram to my parents initially to say, he's been born. We called him Robert William. Robert William's been born. He's hale and hearty. Everything's good. And I sent that from that little village area, and it had to go by Morse code to a major area where they then send it by teletype or something like that. And when he died, I had to change things. I had to send a message saying he was born, but now he's taken on the next day. And so on our way down to bury him, we stopped at the big city where the teletype was, and I walked into the telegram area and I said to them, I want to send an express telegram to Australia. And I wrote the telegram, Robert William, born on 18th, taken on the 19th, help us, pray for us. And I sent that message to my parents. And the man in the office there said to me, oh, are you talking about this baby? And he brought me the telegram that I had sent on the day before from the office in the village. He said it came through on Morse code. I haven't sent it to Australia yet. I said, thank God you haven't sent it to us.
Yeah.
Thank God. And he said, I do have to send it. I said, well, delay sending it, because this one must go first. And anyhow, it arrived, and my father took it along to church, and everyone obviously was concerned for us. They prayed for us, but they sent me a message, and their telegram simply said, praying for you, read John chapter 13, verses 7 and 8. And of course, those verses simply say, when Jesus was washing the feet of his disciples, those verses say, as Peter argued, don't wash my feet, Jesus said, what I'm doing now you don't understand, you will understand later. Look, I can tell you that verse was such a comfort to me. The fact is that we are God's servants. We'd given our all to him. He's chosen to take our second baby to be with him, and yet he has a purpose. Well, I only found out that purpose 8 years later. That purpose 8 years later was this. There was a couple that we were contacting. She became a believer and a follower of Jesus, but he didn't, and he wasn't interested. They unfortunately were not able to have any children, but they adopted a beautiful little boy, and I was thrilled for them and blessed them. And what's this little boy? I went off to preach in some village some 3 hours away, and I was busily doing that work over a weekend. And in the middle of my final message on a Sunday night, I saw a lad from our church in the city come to that little village, put his hands up to me and say, stop, stop, stop. I stopped. He said, you've got to come. That little boy has died. Oh, I was heartbroken. So I drove home. I got home at 3 o'clock in the morning, and there on our coffee table was a little apple box. In that apple box was a baby boy. That little baby boy had to be buried. And so next morning we put that apple box in the back of the car, drove this time just the 20 Ks to where that cemetery was. Someone had dug a grave. I got down in the grave. I put that little apple box in the bottom of the grave. And then I went for a walk with the Father, the one who had not been prepared to talk to me about the gospel, about the things of Jesus. And as we walked, he was very angry. He said, they don't understand. No one understands. I said, who are you talking about? He said, well, my officers, he's an army officer. He said, all my fellow officers, when I told them that my baby had died, they laughed. And they said, wasn't even your baby. You adopted him. There's plenty more. You can get more. Oh, there's plenty of babies like that around. You can get half a dozen if you like. He said, they don't understand. This was my son. I gave this boy my name. This boy is in my heart. No one understands. And I said, I do. He said, what would you? And it was quite bold. What would you understand? I said, come with me. And I showed him the grave of my son. He said, oh, you do understand? I said, yes. You know, he got transferred away because he was an officer and he progressed up the line, but he became a believer in Jesus. His wife kept corresponding with Glad. And I remember the letter that came, which says, I'm wanting to tell you that my husband is now a follower of Jesus. Look, the joy that we felt. And I thought to myself, well, at a cost to us of the loss of our baby, this man will now be with us in heaven. And he became a very senior officer in the Indian Army, so much so that he commanded many, many, many men. And he became a believer. And so that incident was really tough. But at the same time, when we realize that God makes no mistake, and I want to tell you that Moses sang a song, and the song was in Deuteronomy where it says, ascribe greatness to our God, the rock. His ways are perfect. All his ways are just or right. He does no wrong. And that has been in my heart ever since, knowing that when things like this happen, then God has a purpose and a plan. And my role is to be submissive and to surrender. Was there a heartache? Of course. Did we grieve? Of course. We're human. But we could understand that God was prepared to take our child, knowing, well, I think he trusted us in the taking of our child, so that in the years to come, we would be in a position to help that man, that very important man, to become a follower of Jesus. And so for me, the incident was tough. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. Life was not easy, but it was a time when we proved the faithfulness of God in a very special way.
Well, that was part 2 of Eric Scadabow's conversation with Bill Forward, who's sharing his and his wife Glad's story as a couple. We'll hear more of their life journey together next time as the Bill and Glad love story continues. But before we end today, I just want to focus on the message Bill and Glad received from their home church after the death of their baby. It said, praying for you, read John chapter 13, verse 7, which is where Jesus tells his disciples, what I'm doing now you don't understand. You will understand later. And this verse was a great comfort to Bill and Glad after the death of their baby. And so often in life, at the time, we don't understand why tragedy strikes. But we do know that if we put our faith in the Lord, we will get a better understanding later. And that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. This, of course, is difficult at the time while we're mourning, but if we hang on to the Lord in faith, he will give us the strength to get through the valleys of life. Well, thanks for joining us for part 2 of Bill and Glad's story. There are more parts to come in their journey, and we invite you to join us for all of them in this series. Until next time, I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Next time on The Story.
We arrived finally at our destination on the other side of India, and as we arrived, all the church leaders were on the platform waiting for us to come. They said, we sent you 3 telegrams. We asked you to come. And I said, well, I got nothing. I'm here because he asked me to come. They said, don't you know that the other preacher for this Bible class has died. He had a heart attack. He died. And we asked you to come and be the teacher.
Bill Forward joins us once again to share more about his and his wife Glad's time as missionaries in India. It all began when they were a young couple in their early 20s, but little did they know the remarkable ways that God would use them in ministry for His honour and glory. We'll hear more of Bill and Glad's story next time.
The Story. Just another way Vision is helping you look to God daily.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.